The first thing you notice isn't the blood. It's the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, not the kind that comes after a celebration. This is a heavy quiet, like the house itself is holding its breath because it already knows what just happened inside it. A man stands in the dark of an unfamiliar kitchen, soaking wet from the night air, clothes stiff with dirt and sweat. Something on his leg is wrapped badly, tight in places, loose in others, dark patches seeping through the fabric. The smell follows him like a shadow, damp earth, stale body heat, and something metallic. He listens. Above him, the floorboards creak, soft, uncertain. Someone is awake. Someone heard something. He doesn't rush. He doesn't run, because he isn't here to steal. Not anymore. The knife in his hand looks too ordinary for what it's about to do. He moves like he's rehearsed this in his head, like he's done it before, like the fear of getting caught is smaller than whatever is burning in him. Stairs rise into darkness. He climbs them slowly, careful with every step, but not careful enough. A board complains under his weight. Upstairs, a door opens. A voice, male, startled, still half asleep, breaks the silence with confusion turning into alarm. The intruder freezes for half a second, and then the knife starts moving. Not once, not twice, again and again, fast, brutal, without strategy, panic disguised as rage. The air fills with a sound that doesn't belong in a family home. Wet impact, choking breath, sudden pleading. The victim fights, but sleep is a disadvantage you don't recover from. The attacker doesn't stop until the movement underneath him becomes weak, then stops entirely. And that's when the second door opens. Footsteps hit the landing, heavier, older, urgent. A father responding to his child's terror. He sees a shape over the bed, sees the arm, sees the blade. He doesn't even get a full sentence out before the attacker turns on him like an animal startled in its feeding. A slash, then another. The father stumbles backwards, grasping for balance, for the rail, for anything. But he's already losing too much. He collapses down the stairs, thud after thud, like a body thrown away. He lands at the bottom in a position that looks unnatural, head bent, limbs wrong. And the house goes quiet again. Not because the danger is over, because the danger is just getting started. Somewhere downstairs, a woman is awake now, fully awake, heart sprinting inside her chest. She's a professional, a healer. She's spent her life fixing what breaks. But there are footsteps outside her door, slow and deliberate, the kind that say, "I know you're in here." She tries to hide, tries to make herself smaller than her own fear. And when the door opens, she sees him. This man is not wearing a mask. He wants to be seen. He wants her to understand that this is real. She begs, not in poetic words, not in movie lines, the desperate, humiliating kind of begging that happens when a person realizes morality doesn't work on what's standing in front of them. She offers money, cash, anything, but the intruder doesn't come here for money. He comes closer. She fights, and the violence that follows is so excessive it doesn't even look like self-defense on his part. It looks like punishment, like hate. Blows, stabs, over and over. Even when she collapses, he keeps going. Later, the number will be counted. The wounds will be measured. Some will be described as so deep they reached bone. But right now, in this moment, none of that matters. What matters is that the house has become a trap. The dead don't scream anymore. The living still can. Upstairs, in another bedroom, there's someone listening, not moving, not breathing properly. A young woman lies rigid under her blankets, staring at darkness and hearing the impossible happening to the people who made her life safe. She doesn't know what to do because nothing in her life prepared her for this. She hears a body fall down the stairs. She hears a door slam. She hears her mother's voice break. And then she hears the footsteps, now closer, coming back up. The bedroom door opens. A silhouette fills the doorway, and the smell hits her first. Blood has a smell, warm, thick, unmistakable.
The intruder steps in. He's drenched. Not just speckled, not stained, drenched. He holds the knife like it belongs to him, and he speaks calmly like they're alone in a room for a normal reason. He tells her to be quiet. He tells her what he's done. And then he does something worse. Something that doesn't just end lives, but destroys the idea of safety forever. The young woman survives, but survival is not victory, not in the way people want it to be. It's endurance. It's being forced to wake up tomorrow with a mind that will never forget. Later, long after the worst is done, after she's been violated and threatened and broken, the intruder drags her through the house, down those same stairs, past a body at the bottom that used to be the center of the home, and out into the back garden, where only hours earlier there was laughter, wedding music, glasses clinking, proud smiles under warm light. Now there's a large white marquee tent standing like the hollow shell of happiness. He ties her to a chair inside it. Then he eats. The wedding food, leftovers from celebration. He drinks from a bottle meant for toasts. And as she sits bound and shaking, he talks, casual, almost pleased with himself, like this whole night has been an opportunity he didn't want to waste. He gives himself a name, not his real one, a name that makes him feel clever, untouchable. He calls himself the Fox. And here's the part that makes people feel sick when they learn it afterwards. He doesn't kill her. He leaves her alive, bound, traumatized, surrounded by evidence of what he did. And that single decision raises the question that will haunt investigators and the public alike. Why would someone capable of this leave a witness? Was it arrogance? Was it calculation? Or was it something worse? Something psychological, like he wanted her to live with it? Because for monsters like this, control doesn't end when the knife stops moving. Control can last for decades. Before we go deeper, welcome back. And if you're watching this right now, whether it's daytime or you're up late with the lights off, tap like to support the work that goes into telling these stories the right way. Share this with someone who watches true crime like you do. And I want you to comment where you're watching from, country, city, even just bedroom or night shift. Because this case, it proves something terrifying. Sometimes danger doesn't come with warning. It walks right into the safest place you know and treats it like it belongs there. By morning, the yard looks normal from the road. The marquee still stands. The expensive house sits quiet and respectable, like nothing happened. But inside, a family has been erased. A father, a mother, a son, and one young woman left behind, tied up like an object, waiting for someone to find her before the shock turns into something entirely different. When the men arrive to take down the tent, they expect work. They don't expect to meet the echo of violence. They don't expect the smell. They don't expect a survivor. And yet that survivor becomes the most important person in the entire case, because she saw his face, she heard his voice, and she lived long enough to tell police exactly what they were hunting. This story doesn't begin with a criminal mastermind. It begins with something far frightening. A man with nothing left to lose, who had already decided the world owed him something, and was willing to take it. Question for you, comment this. Do you think he left her alive because he believed he was too smart to be caught? Or because he wanted someone to carry the horror forward? Because in the next act, we pull back. Not to soften the terror, but to reveal how a celebration in a quiet rural home became the perfect doorway for a stranger who should never have been free in the first place.
The worst part of a night like this isn't only what happened, it's what happens after, when the mind starts trying to make sense of something that has no sense inside it. Because by sunrise, the house isn't just a crime scene, it's a contradiction, a respectable street, a safe village, a family with money, education, stability, and inside that home, a level of violence so intimate, so excessive, it feels personal, even though the killer was a stranger. That is what makes this case stick to people. Not just the brutality, but the question it forces into the open: how does a monster find you when you've done nothing wrong? Morning light exposes what darkness hides. Outside, the marquee still stands in the garden like a ghost of joy. The lawn is flattened from the wedding tables, the dance floor, the feet of guests who had laughed there only hours earlier. Everything looks normal, almost. There's still confetti in places, streamers half tangled, the quiet leftovers of celebration. But the closer you get to the house, the more the air changes. There's a wrongness, not visible, not yet. The kind of wrongness animals sense, the kind of wrongness that makes the back of your neck tighten. The men from the rental company arrive to dismantle the marquee. It's just a job. They've done this 100 times. Weddings are happy. Weddings are predictable. They walk through the garden toward the tent, and then they see her. At first, it doesn't even compute. A teenage girl, tied to a chair, pale and rigid like her body has shut down to survive, clothing disheveled, hair matted, eyes wide in the way eyes look when they've watched something no human should have to witness. For a moment, they think maybe it's a prank, some kind of drunken wedding night joke. Then they notice the bruising. Then they notice her shaking. Then they hear the sound she makes when she tries to speak, a sound that isn't language, a sound that is closer to the body giving up. They rush her, they untie her, and she collapses as soon as she's free because her limbs aren't functioning normally anymore. Nothing in her wants to move, not even time. Someone calls police, someone calls ambulances, and within minutes, the house that was meant to be a sanctuary becomes a magnet for uniforms and flashing lights. But even police, trained to face the ugliest parts of human behavior, pause when they enter, not because they're inexperienced, because there are scenes you don't forget. There are scenes that rewire you. A father lies at the bottom of the stairs, not in a way that suggests an accident, in a way that screams violence so fast the body didn't even have time to understand it was dying. A mother is found downstairs. She fought, not symbolically, not briefly. Her injuries show exactly what kind of death she faced, one where survival was possible only if she became an animal. And upstairs, the son, dead in his bed, killed in the place a young man should be safest. A bed isn't just a bed, it's the one place where you don't expect war. This is what investigators call an overkill scene, not because that term captures horror properly, but because it's the only word they have for the kind of violence that continues even after the victim is already beyond saving. This isn't robbery. This isn't a break-in gone wrong. This is elimination. This is domination. This is rage with direction. And then the survivor, the youngest daughter, tells them something that makes the air in the room freeze. She says he wasn't silent. He didn't hide. He spoke. He told her what he did. He referred to himself with a name, a nickname, like he wanted to build a myth around himself. He called himself the Fox. When crimes happen in quiet places, the fear spreads faster than the facts. In a city, people hide behind anonymity. In a rural village, everyone knows everyone. Everyone feels close enough to danger that they start checking their doors. And here's what the public learns within hours. This wasn't a family argument. This wasn't someone the victims knew. This wasn't a grudge. A stranger walked into a home after a wedding and butchered almost an entire family. If a man can do that once, why wouldn't he do it again? It becomes the kind of case that doesn't just haunt a town, it contaminates it. Because now every resident has to live with a new possibility, that the boundary between safe and targeted can be as thin as a faulty lock. And in this case, there was one. A patio door, a broken catch, a door that wouldn't lock properly, a small, mundane problem the father assumed he'd fix soon. Because why rush? This is door. People leave doors unlocked. People trust. People believe the world outside can't reach them. That belief lasted until a man crouched in their trees and watched their happiness like a starving animal. Investigators work fast because the case isn't just murder, it's public terror. They start where they always start. Who did the family know? Who had access?
Who had motive? But the answer keeps coming back empty. The father was 59-year-old solicitor, respected. The mother, 55, was a doctor, also respected. Their home was valuable, around £150,000, and it sat in a quiet, idyllic village. The oldest daughter had just gotten married in that garden. Hundreds of guests attended. And now detectives realize something that makes their job almost impossible. If the killer came from the wedding, there are hundreds of possible connections. Caterers, photographers, friends of friends, people hired to set up the marquee, people delivering supplies, strangers who only needed one reason to walk onto that property without raising suspicion. A wedding is the perfect camouflage, because weddings invite outsiders. Weddings create noise. Weddings create distraction. And if a predator was watching from the edge of the garden, no one would have noticed. That night, the family cleaned up slowly. Plates, plastic bags, streamers. The father, Basil, told them there was no rush. The marquee company would return in the morning. So they went inside, exhausted, happy, unaware. And outside, hidden in the trees, someone made a decision. Not impulsively, not suddenly, but like a man who recognizes opportunity the way others recognize a meal. The survivor's description becomes everything, because she didn't just see the killer, she spent time with him, time that feels like eternity when you're bound and helpless. She describes him carefully, his build, his face, his manner, his voice. And then police do what they must do in the modern world of manhunts. They bring in an artist. The sketch is produced, and what happens next is a crossroads, one decision that shifts the case from local tragedy into national panic. Authorities release the sketch publicly almost immediately because they believe one thing with complete certainty. A man who could do this is capable of doing it again. This isn't someone who snapped once. This is someone who doesn't have limits. And now, the entire country is asked to look at a face and decide, have you seen him? Have you passed him on the street? Have you served him in a shop? Have you had him in your pub? The phone lines light up. Tips flood in. And within hours, investigators are drowning not in evidence, but in information. Everyone wants to help. Everyone wants to be the one who recognizes the face. Everyone also wants to protect themselves, because now the fear has a shape. And when fear has a shape, it becomes contagious. But one tip rises above the noise, not from a terrified villager, not from a wedding guest, from a police officer in North Yorkshire. An officer who sees the sketch and feels something cold move through him. Because that face isn't unfamiliar. That face belongs to someone he already knows, someone who shouldn't even be outside, someone dangerous enough that the officer remembers him without hesitation. He contacts the lead detective in South Yorkshire, and when he speaks, he doesn't speak with uncertainty. He speaks like a man holding the missing piece. He says he believes he knows exactly who the door killer is, and he says something even more important. He says he has fingerprints ready for comparison. Fingerprint evidence changes everything, because up until now, investigators have a survivor statement, a sketch, a town terrified, and too many leads to chase. But fingerprints? Fingerprints don't care about fear. Fingerprints don't misremember. Fingerprints don't panic. They are the silent proof that turns suspicion into certainty. Investigators rush to compare what they lifted from the scene, objects touched during the night, with the fingerprints the North Yorkshire officer already has. And when the result comes back, it's an exact match. The man who escaped custody a month ago, the man suspected of burglary and rape, the man with a violent history, is the same man who walked into a wedding home and slaughtered a family. His name is no longer a mystery. The fox is real. And now the question changes, because it's no longer who did this. It becomes something much more chilling. Where is he right now? Imagine being a detective in that moment. You know what he's capable of. You've seen what he leaves behind. And you also know something else, the most dangerous thing of all. He's been running for weeks already, sleeping rough, hiding in fields, moving through the country. A man like that doesn't just want freedom. He wants control. He wants food. He wants shelter. He wants victims. And now he knows the nation is watching, which means his next move could be anything. He could flee, he could vanish, or he could escalate, because predators don't always run when hunted. Sometimes they become bolder. Sometimes they...
By the time the fingerprints matched, the case stopped being local. It stopped being a tragedy confined to one village, one home, one ruined family. Because the moment police confirmed Arthur Hutchinson was the man behind the killings, the danger changed shape. It became mobile, it became national, and it became urgent. A killer like this doesn't need a motive that makes sense. He doesn't need a plan that's rational. He doesn't need a reason you can predict. He needs only three things: a body, a moment, and the belief that he can take what he wants. And now, in late 1983, the entire country was forced to accept something chilling. Arthur Hutchinson was free. Not free in the way most people imagine, going to work, walking streets openly. Free like an infected wound is free. Free like a fire is free. Moving quietly through farmland, through alleyways, through abandoned buildings, carried forward by hunger, rage, and an ego so swollen it could no longer fit inside a normal life. Because Arthur Hutchinson didn't just want to survive on the run. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to be remembered. The first wave of fear hit Dorr almost immediately. People in the village began locking doors they'd never locked before. Curtains twitched, lights stayed on, children slept with parents. The broken illusion of safety spread outward like ripples. Because a crime like this doesn't just kill people, it kills the belief that it can't happen here. And police understood something the public didn't yet. If Arthur Hutchinson had made it into one home, he could make it into another. And he wasn't just a murderer, he was a rapist, a predator with a history. Which meant his next victim wouldn't be chosen randomly. It would be chosen because she fit a pattern. Young, vulnerable, and in his mind, available. So South Yorkshire police moved fast. They released his description. They released the sketch. Then, once the match was confirmed, they escalated to something bigger. A close-up photo. A countrywide warning. The message was simple. If you see this man, do not approach. Call police. But there's a dark irony in warnings like that, because they protect civilians and they feed the killer. To someone like Arthur Hutchinson, being hunted isn't shameful. It's proof of importance. It's validation. And the more his face spread across newspapers, the more the nickname the Fox echoed through the public, the more Arthur began to feel like he had finally become the thing he always believed he was. Not a petty criminal, not a familiar nuisance, but a figure, a name, a nightmare. Police launched what became, at the time, one of the biggest manhunts in the country's history. Hundreds of officers, police dogs, helicopters, thousands of man-hours, farmland combed, woodland searched, abandoned barns checked, every potential hiding place treated like it might contain something that bites. And somewhere out there, moving through the same countryside, Arthur Hutchinson was watching this unfold like a show made just for him. Because Arthur didn't run like a man afraid of prison. He ran like a man addicted to attention. He moved from city to city, slipping through places where strangers never looked twice at another stranger. He used disguises, wigs, fake beards, cheap tricks that worked because most people don't want to believe the man standing next to them is danger. He wasn't hiding deep in wilderness 24/7. He wasn't living like an animal all the time. Sometimes he acted like a normal man. He drank in pubs, he walked streets, he blended in. And when you understand that, it becomes even more terrifying. Because it means at the exact same time the country was panicking, Arthur Hutchinson could have been standing casually in a public place, listening to strangers talk about him, enjoying the power of being the fear in their voices. And the most disturbing part? He wasn't silent. He didn't stay invisible. He reached out. There are criminals who want to disappear, and then there are criminals like Arthur Hutchinson who want to perform. He wrote to a Yorkshire newspaper, a letter that repeatedly called him the Fox, like he was trying to brand himself, to build legend around his violence. This wasn't confession out of guilt. This wasn't remorse. This was marketing. Because in Arthur's mind, the murders weren't just an act. They were an identity. He wanted a role. He wanted to be the villain people whispered about. And when the excitement around the letter started to fade, Arthur did something that shows you exactly how his ego worked. He called the newspaper office. He phoned directly, not with a disguised voice, not with caution, but with the arrogance of a man who believed the hunt made him untouchable. He taunted the person on the line. He laughed. He hinted at where he was. He painted himself as clever, elusive, like he was playing chess with the police while everyone else played checkers. And the person on the other end of the phone? They weren't talking to a myth. They were talking to a real man who had stabbed a family to death and still felt entitled to entertainment. For Arthur, this wasn't just escape. This was pleasure. The kind of pleasure that comes from knowing you've shattered people and they can't touch you. And that's a terrifying thing for law enforcement to confront. A killer motivated not only by violence, but by recognition. But here's what Arthur didn't realize. He wasn't a genius. He wasn't as invisible as he thought. And the same arrogance that made him call the newspaper would eventually point police directly to him. Because Arthur still had something he couldn't cut away completely. A connection. A tether. His mother. Somewhere inside this fox persona, there was still a man who couldn't fully detach from the place he came from. He was injured, in pain, bleeding. And what happens to injured predators? They return to familiar ground. They circle back to what feels safe. And Arthur did exactly that. He contacted his mother. He called her. And police did what they had to do because public safety demanded it. They tapped her phone, listened, waited. And then, in one of those conversations, Arthur said something that ended the illusion of his brilliance. He said he was coming back to Hartlepool, coming home, back to the place where everyone knew his name, where he had always been seen. For a moment, Arthur believed he could return like a king. But what he was really doing was revealing himself, handing police the map. The end came on November 5th, 1983, less than 2 weeks after the Leighton massacre. Arthur Hutchinson was tracked to farmland near his mother's home. Police swarmed the area. They moved in carefully. But Arthur didn't surrender like a man beaten. He tried to run. He sprinted across a field, waving his knife, a wounded, desperate man clinging to the only power he understood. Dogs were released, officers charged, and Arthur was taken down, forced into the mud, pinned. Handcuffs snapped shut, and as officers dragged him up, he reportedly shouted something that revealed the childishness behind the monster. That he wasn't a murderer, that he should have stayed in his foxhole. Even then, he was still clinging to the nickname, still clinging to the myth, still trying to control the narrative. But now the performance was over. The fox was caught, and the entire country exhaled for the first time in weeks. But what no one understood yet was catching him was only the start. Because the truth of what happened inside that house, the full detail, the full cruelty, the full collapse of humanity, had not yet been shown to the world. That would come later, in court, in evidence, in a decision that changed British criminal history forever.
The police now have a name, a face, a set of fingerprints,
and a country holding its breath. But once a case reaches that stage, once the mystery becomes a man, the mind naturally reaches for a dangerous kind of comfort. People tell themselves this must have been rare, unthinkable, a once-in-a-generation monster that came from nowhere, struck once, and will never exist again. But the truth is never that clean. Because men like Arthur Hutchinson don't appear overnight. They don't arrive fully formed like a horror character. They accumulate. They escalate. They test the world in smaller ways until the world teaches them a lesson it never intended to teach. That boundaries are negotiable. That consequences are temporary. That other people can be hurt and life still goes on. When investigators look back through Hutchinson's history, they don't find a single turning point. They find a path, a long one. And the disturbing part isn't only what he did, it's how early he started and how often he was allowed to continue. Arthur Hutchinson was born in 1941 in Hartlepool, an industrial town on England's northeast coast. It wasn't a glamorous place. It was practical, hard-edged, built around labor and routine. He grew up on a council estate, one of 8 children in a large family where privacy was scarce and attention wasn't guaranteed, it was competed for. Some children in that environment become quiet and cautious. Others become louder, sharper, desperate to be noticed. From early on, Hutchinson wasn't simply unruly, he was disturbing. Accounts from his early life describe behavior that moved beyond mischief and into harm close enough to his own family to be impossible to ignore. While most children were learning basic empathy, Hutchinson was already demonstrating something else, an ability to injure, to frighten, to dominate. And there were early indications of sexual offending while he was still a child himself, actions so far outside ordinary development that they signal something deeply wrong in his wiring. That kind of behavior matters because it reframes everything that happens later. It suggests this wasn't an adult man who suddenly lost control. It was a boy who discovered he could violate other people and kept moving in that direction. As he reached his teenage years, the outward version of Hutchinson looked more ordinary, not harmless, just familiar to police. He began committing petty crimes, stealing cars, tampering with vehicles, switching plates. The kind of offenses that exist in every town, the kind that often get dismissed as juvenile delinquency. And in those early years, that's how he was treated, like a local troublemaker, a nuisance, not a nightmare. But for certain people, petty crime isn't just about money. It's about feeling powerful. It's about taking something that belongs to someone else just to prove you can. It's about seeing what happens when you cross a line and learning very quickly how far society will let you go. And Hutchinson learned. Every time he was caught and the world didn't end, the lesson grew stronger. Not the lesson most people learn, don't do this again. A different lesson. I can survive this. And once a person learns they can survive consequences, consequences stop functioning as deterrents. They become obstacles. Temporary ones. At 18, Hutchinson briefly wore the costume of normal life. He got his next-door neighbor, Margaret, pregnant. Then he married her. To outsiders, it can look like responsibility, a young man trying to do the right thing. But to someone like Hutchinson, relationships aren't built on partnership. They're built on possession. And Margaret later described how quickly his mask fell. For a short period, he could appear charming, almost ideal. And then, without warning, he became terrifying. The marriage descended into abuse, constant cheating, physical violence, and repeated sexual violation. Not because he couldn't control himself, because control was the point. Men like Hutchinson don't abuse because they're overwhelmed. They abuse because they want someone else to feel helpless. That marriage lasted 3 years before Margaret escaped and divorced him. And if the story ended there, you could almost imagine him being forced to confront what he was. But predators don't interpret consequences the way ordinary people do.
They don't respond with shame. They respond with resentment. They don't accept boundaries. They treat them as betrayal. And over time, that resentment hardens into something especially dangerous, a belief that the world owes them, that other people exist to serve them, that rejection is injustice. Arthur Hutchinson's adult life became a revolving door: crime, arrest, custody, release. He wasn't a mystery to law enforcement. He was known. Police officers in the region encountered him repeatedly. His record grew: theft, vandalism, car crime, robbery, weapons-related offenses. But it threaded through it was the pattern that mattered most, the pattern that would eventually become catastrophic: sexual violence. A long history of targeting women and girls, and that pattern never softened with time. It didn't fade. It didn't become manageable. It became habitual, a language he returned to, an expression of entitlement, an assertion of dominance. He married later, another rushed relationship that collapsed under the same forces: volatility, violence, infidelity. It wasn't coincidence. It was repetition. And repetition is where the foundation of danger is built. Because repetition is what trains a predator's confidence. It teaches him that women can be harmed, that victims can be silenced, that consequences can be endured, that normal people recover and move on, while he continues. Even his self-image reveals the psychology at work. He liked to call himself the Fox, a name meant to imply cleverness, elusiveness, superiority. But what's unsettling isn't that he thought highly of himself, it's that he needed to. Because the nickname wasn't just ego, it was protection. A story he told himself so he could keep moving through life without facing the truth of what he was. Then, in September 1983, the story reached a new stage. Arthur Hutchinson was arrested on suspicion of burglary and the rape of a young woman. He was in custody, contained, and for a brief moment the public was safer. But on the 8th of September, he escaped Selby Police Station by climbing out of a bathroom window. It wasn't a sophisticated escape, it was desperate, and during it he injured his knee badly, an injury that followed him for weeks. The detail matters not because it's dramatic, but because of what it does psychologically. Pain narrows the mind, it sharpens irritability, it shortens patience. And in a man already driven by resentment and entitlement, pain becomes fuel. Now he wasn't only a predator, he was a predator on the run, sleeping rough, stealing food, avoiding capture, living without comfort, without dignity, without the sense of control he depended on. And men like Hutchinson lose control, they seek it out again, violently. He spent days moving through back streets, then traveled south, around 50 miles, into countryside. Eventually, he reached Dorr, a quiet rural village near Sheffield. He had no known associates there, no clear reason to choose it. He never fully explained why he went, but perhaps the reason was simple. Quiet places believe in safety. Quiet places don't expect predators to be watching, and predators thrive where people don't expect them. On the 23rd of October 1983, the village offered him something that would become fatal. Music, laughter, a celebration. At the Leighton home on Dorr Road, a wedding had taken place. A marquee in the back garden, food left over, champagne, guests coming and going. A house full of life. And from the edge of that garden, hidden in trees, Hutchinson watched. At first, the attraction could have been practical. He was hungry, he was injured, he was desperate. A well-off home might mean money, valuables, food. But then, according to what is known, his attention narrowed onto something else. An 18-year-old girl connected to the household. And in that narrowing, the entire tone of the night shifted. Because theft is an act. Predation is a mindset. It's not I need, it's I want. And once a predator decides he wants something, everything around it becomes an obstacle. A father becomes an obstacle. A brother becomes an obstacle. A mother becomes an obstacle. A house becomes a stage, and the predator becomes entitled to the outcome. The Laytons did what families do after weddings. They cleaned, they laughed softly, they moved tiredly, they looked at leftovers and mess and told themselves they would handle the rest tomorrow. Basil Layton, a 59-year-old solicitor, was proud. Not in a loud way, in the quiet way fathers are proud when they've watched their children grow into adults. His wife, Averill, a doctor, was exhausted in the way people are exhausted after giving everything to a family event. They had done nothing reckless at all. But that's what makes the next detail so horrifyingly ordinary. When Basil slid the patio doors shut after the night ended, the catch didn't lock properly. A small mechanical failure, the kind of thing you don't feel is urgent in a safe village.
When Arthur Hutchinson was caught, people wanted to believe the fear had an off switch. That the moment the handcuffs closed, the nightmare closed with them. But that's not how cases like this work. Because the arrest doesn't end terror, it reorganizes it. It moves it from fields and back roads into something colder, something public, something procedural. Now the danger is no longer a man running free. Now it's a man sitting still while everyone else tries to prove what he did, and more importantly, tries to prove what he is. And that second part matters more than most people realize. Because guilt can be argued, guilt can be denied, guilt can be clouded with technicalities. But what he is, that's harder to hide. A predator doesn't just commit crimes. A predator carries a pattern. And once you see the pattern clearly, the real threat is not the past, it's the future. The terrifying possibility that this type of man could ever be allowed near ordinary life again. That's why the pressure after Hutchinson's capture doesn't fade. It builds, it tightens, it becomes suffocating. Not only for him, but for investigators, prosecutors, jurors, and the public. Because the country isn't simply demanding a conviction, it's demanding certainty. Inside the police station, Hutchinson is not the fox anymore. Not the phantom in the fields, not the mysterious face on wanted posters, not the voice that taunted a newspaper over the phone. He's just a man in custody again, dirty, exhausted, injured, and furious. And it's the fury that stands out, not the fear. Most people imagine a captured killer is scared, but men like Hutchinson don't break the way normal people break. What they feel isn't regret, it's insult. It's the humiliation of being restrained. Because restraint means someone else finally holds power over them. Even his wound becomes part of that humiliation. The knee he tore open escaping custody weeks earlier is still there, angry and swollen and leaking through bandages. A constant reminder that his escape wasn't clean or clever. He wanted to move like a legend, but the truth is he's been hobbling through the countryside like a wounded animal. And now, sitting under fluorescent lights, he has nothing to do but stew in the one emotion he always returns to when cornered: entitlement. He doesn't think he deserves punishment. He thinks he deserves attention. He thinks he deserves to be feared. So even in custody, he still tries to control the room. He denies, he shifts, he postures. He tries to turn himself into a riddle again because riddles feel powerful. But investigators don't need riddles. They need proof. And unlike Hutchinson, proof doesn't crave attention. Proof is patient. Police work the case like surgeons. Every item from the scene becomes a piece of anatomy. Every trace becomes a nerve. Every object becomes a question. The champagne bottle, the surfaces in the house, anything he touched while he lingered after murder. Because that lingering is what makes the crime feel unreal to the average person. It's what separates a frantic intruder from something darker. A person committing a crime and fleeing is one type of criminal. A person committing murder and then staying, eating, drinking, talking like he belongs there, that's a different type entirely. That's not just violence, that's ownership. It's the psychological signature of someone who believes human life is his to rearrange. And that's exactly what prosecutors will later need to show in court. Not just that Hutchinson was present, but that Hutchinson was in control. That he chose what he did, that he understood it, that he enjoyed it.
Because if you can prove that, you remove one of the most common escape routes in court. The idea of confusion, the idea of accident, the idea of panic. Panic doesn't sit down for wedding leftovers. Panic doesn't pour champagne. Panic doesn't stay and talk. The pressure becomes most intense around Nicola, because in a case built on a survivor, the survivor becomes a battlefield. Even when you have physical evidence, defense teams know something the public forgets. A jury is human. A jury is influenced by emotion, by certainty, by doubt. And Nicola is the living bridge between the jury and the horror. Her testimony isn't just a description of events, it's a direct line into the killer's behavior after the murders. She can describe the knife, the smell, the blood, the sound of him moving through her home like a decision. She can describe the way he spoke, calm, casual, almost conversational. And perhaps most chilling, she can describe the way he referred to himself repeatedly, like he was proud of the identity he'd built. That matters. Because people who commit crimes in shame hide their faces. They avoid language that make them real. They don't brand themselves. But Hutchinson branded himself. He wanted the story, which means he wanted the power. And the defense knows this is deadly. So they will do what defense does in cases involving trauma. They will try to turn Nicola's memory into something unreliable. They won't call her a liar outright, not always. They will imply, they will suggest, they will circle. They will ask the same thing 3 different ways, hoping fatigue or stress produces a tiny inconsistency. Because in court, a tiny inconsistency can be inflated into doubt. And doubt is the only oxygen a guilty man needs. So Nicola is not simply preparing to tell the truth, she is preparing to fight for the truth, against a machine designed to test her until she cracks. And she has to do it while carrying grief heavy enough to fold most people in half. Her father dead, her mother dead, her brother dead, the family home contaminated forever, and yet she has to sit in front of strangers and convert the unspeakable into sentences that make sense. That's the pressure no one sees. By the time the trial arrives, the prosecution understands something important. This case isn't just violent, it's symbolic. It represents the invasion of safety itself, a wedding home, a rural village, a respected family, a celebration of love. And then a stranger in the dark, turning all of it into a murder scene. The public isn't only watching for justice, they're watching for reassurance. They want to believe the system can respond to a crime like this with something powerful enough to match it. And that's why the prosecutors take a step that at the time shocks the courtroom. They show the jury a video, a police recording of the scene. 7 minutes. It sounds short until you consider what it contains. A walk through the house, the staircase, the rooms, the physical aftermath, the proof that this wasn't just murder, it was obliteration. Video does something photos can't do. It removes the buffer. It makes jurors feel like they're entering the home themselves. And as the camera passes through hallways and door frames, the jury isn't only seeing the Layton home, they are imagining their own. Their stairs, their bedrooms, their children asleep upstairs. That is what creates the pressure that crushes any defense narrative. Because once a person imagines this happening to them, innocence arguments start sounding like insult. You can't technicality your way out of imagery like that. Not easily. And that's exactly why the prosecution does it. To prevent Hutchinson from hiding behind the abstract. To make the jury feel the truth in their stomach, not just in their brain. The courtroom becomes a shared trauma. Even the judge can't change what jurors will carry home afterward. The legal system has asked ordinary citizens to witness something they were never meant to witness. And once you witness it, it never leaves properly. As days pass, the case stops being about whether he is guilty. It becomes about what society is going to do with him. Because the more people hear the details, the more one phrase begins surfacing everywhere, quietly, insistently. Life's sentence doesn't feel like enough. Not because people crave revenge, because they crave certainty. They want to know he can never do this again. They want to know there will never be a day, decades later, when another family sees his name in headlines and hears the words, "illegible for parole." That is the pressure building underneath the trial. Public pressure, political pressure, moral pressure. The kind of pressure that bends systems. Because the system is built on the belief that time changes people. But Hutchinson doesn't feel like a man time will change. He feels like a man time will only preserve. And as the court grinds forward, something begins forming, unspoken but undeniable. This case is pushing towards a decision the country rarely makes. Not because it's dramatic, because it's final. And finality is what people want most when they're terrified. By the end of this act, the evidence has done its job. The narrative is pinned down. Hutchinson's myth is collapsing. The fox isn't clever anymore. He's exposed. And the country is left holding one haunting reality. If a man like this is ever allowed back into the world, then nothing learned from Dorr matters. No lock is enough. No sentence is enough. No safety is real. And that realization is starting to seep into places it doesn't normally reach, into the logic of law itself.
A conviction feels like closure to people who have never been close to the kind of violence that changes a home forever. To the public, a guilty verdict is a door slamming shut. But to the people inside this case, the investigators, the prosecutors, the survivor, there is no door, only corridors, only aftermath, only a long, cold continuation of the night Hutchinson created. Because even after the evidence lands, even after the truth is spoken aloud in court, the damage keeps moving, like smoke. It travels into every part of life that used to feel normal. And this is where the fracture truly begins. Not the fracture inside one family, that already happened in blood. The fracture inside trust. Trust in safety. Trust in the system. Trust in the idea that evil can be managed using ordinary rules. Because Arthur Hutchinson wasn't ordinary evil. He wasn't a domestic dispute that boiled over. He wasn't a fight that turned fatal. He wasn't an argument gone wrong. He was a predator who moved through life escalating until he reached a point where nothing short of permanent containment felt safe. And once a society recognizes that type exists, it changes everything, even for people who never meet him. Inside court, Hutchinson's presence becomes its own kind of violence. Not physical violence, psychological violence. A reminder that the man who entered that home could still sit upright, breathe, blink, and watch. This is something the public doesn't always understand. A courtroom forces survivors to exist in the same space as the person who destroyed their life, to share air, to share silence, to feel the weight of being watched. And predators understand the power in that. Some offenders look down, some disappear into themselves, but men like Hutchinson often look for ways to reclaim control. A glance, a smirk, a stare held too long, a posture that says without words, "I'm still here." And that matters because Nicola is forced to relive the night under scrutiny. Not just emotional scrutiny, but legal scrutiny. Her voice is a foundation stone for the case, and foundations get tested. She must tell the truth clearly. She must repeat it. She must keep repeating it, even when every repetition feels like a wound opening again. Because trauma isn't like memory. Trauma is like a loop. It drags you back without permission. And the courtroom forces that loop to play in front of strangers. If she falters, if her voice breaks, if she pauses too long, it can be interpreted as weakness. If she remembers too much, it can be interpreted as rehearsed. In cases like this, survivors are placed in an impossible position. They must be human enough to be believable, but not too human, or the defense will call it emotion. And Hutchinson's defense understands this perfectly. So they try to unmake her. Not in one blow, in small surgical cuts. They explore her recollection. They question the timeline. They circle details, where he stood, what he said,
what she heard first. They do it again and again, not because the truth changes, but because exhaustion changes people. The goal isn't to prove she's lying. The goal is to shake the jury's confidence, to make certainty wobble, to remind everyone that law doesn't reward emotion. Law rewards doubt, and Hutchinson needs only a sliver. But something unexpected happens as the trial unfolds. Instead of weakening Nicola, it sharpens her, because what she endured created a kind of clarity that can't be taught. She describes his calmness, his casual speech, his behavior after murder. And these details don't simply support the prosecution, they expose Hutchinson's psychology. They show that the killings weren't accidental, they weren't random frenzy, they were purposeful elimination. Remove obstacles, control the environment, reach the target, then linger, then consume, then leave the witness alive. And it's that last part, the witness, that fractures people the most, because it doesn't fit ordinary criminal logic. If he was so violent, why not kill Nicola too? If he was so desperate, why leave evidence? If he was so frightened of capture, why stay and eat and drink? The answers are never given directly, but the shape emerges. Hutchinson didn't leave Nicola alive because he was merciful. He left her alive because survival can be a punishment. Survival forces memory. Survival forces the victim to carry the horror forward. Survival turns the crime into a permanent presence. And for a man addicted to dominance, that is control extending beyond the night itself. That realization is what breaks people inside the courtroom. Because it means Hutchinson wasn't just seeking pleasure or revenge, he was seeking a legacy. He wanted the story to outlive him. Outside the courtroom, the public begins to change. Not in a dramatic, cinematic way, in small, domestic ways. People check their patio doors twice. They install locks. They stop leaving windows cracked at night. They stop assuming rural means safe. And when they hear the detail about the broken patio catch, the mundane failure that opened the house, they don't hear it like a minor footnote. They hear it like a curse. Because the idea that a family could do everything right, live in a good village, raise children, attend weddings, work respectable jobs, and still be obliterated because a lock didn't catch, that shatters the illusion of control most people depend on to sleep. And once the illusion breaks, something else breaks with it. Trust that the world is predictable. Trust that good choices guarantee safety. Trust that if you do everything properly, you'll be protected. This is the quiet psychological consequence of cases like this. People begin living differently. They become more suspicious, more guarded. And some part of them, small, deep, never relaxes again. But the fracture that truly matters isn't in personal behavior, it's in public faith in the justice system. Because as the trial unfolds, the question shifts again. Not did he do it, that becomes obvious. The question becomes, what does society do with a man like this? Life sentence sounds heavy, but the public begins to understand what life can mean in law. It can mean minimum terms. It can mean parole hearings. It can mean reviews decades later. It can mean the possibility, however slim, that a man becomes elderly, appears less physically dangerous, claims reform, performs regret, and is released under supervision. And for many offenders, that possibility makes sense. People change. Age reduces threat. Time reshapes the mind. But Arthur Hutchinson doesn't feel like one of those offenders. He feels like a man whose violence is not youthful impulse, it's identity. A man who used rape as control, murder as elimination, terror as entertainment. A man who taunted the media while on the run. A man who branded himself. A man who wanted to be feared. The public begins to realize something frightening. If parole is possible, then the case is never truly over. It merely pauses. And no one wants to live with a paused nightmare. Inside the system, professionals begin speaking about him differently. Not publicly, not always, but the language shifts from offender to danger, from sentence to risk. And risk is what parole boards are built on. Risk assessment, rehabilitation potential, probability of reoffense. But the risk Hutchinson represents isn't statistical in the way ordinary systems like. His crime wasn't just severe, it was psychologically revealing. It showed his willingness to invade safety itself and treat lives as disposable. It showed his ability to switch off empathy entirely. It showed something about his appetite that doesn't shrink with time. It may actually grow colder, more calculating. So the system begins leaning towards a conclusion it rarely wants to make. Not because it's morally satisfying, because it's necessary. That conclusion is simple. There are some people society cannot afford to test twice. By the end of this act, the fracture is complete. Not in evidence, not in verdict, in belief. Belief that normal punishment fits abnormal evil. Belief that ordinary legal hope applies to extraordinary danger. Because the deeper the case goes, the clearer it becomes. Arthur Hutchinson didn't just commit murder. He represented the kind of offender the system isn't designed to rehabilitate. He represented permanence. And that changes the shape of the sentence that begins forming behind closed doors. The sentence isn't being designed to make him suffer. It's being designed to remove uncertainty, to remove possibility, to remove the future entirely. Because once the country imagines Arthur Hutchinson outside again, walking streets, breathing free air, standing behind another family home in the dark, it becomes impossible to accept any outcome that leaves that door open. And the most disturbing part is, Hutchinson senses it too. A predator senses when control is truly lost, when the final boundary is being drawn. And when that boundary becomes real, it won't just contain him, it will define the rest of his life in a single merciless word. Never.
The word never doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't slam into the room like a shouted verdict. It seeps in quietly, like cold air under a door. It starts as a feeling, shared but unspoken, among people who have read the evidence, watched the footage, and listened to Nicola's voice tremble under questions no human being should have to answer. A case like this doesn't just convince you that a man is guilty. It convinces you that the usual rules don't fit him, that the normal language of sentencing, years, minimum terms, rehabilitation, sounds almost naive when placed beside what he did. Because what Arthur Hutchinson did wasn't a single eruption. It was a revelation. It revealed the kind of mind capable of slipping through the world unnoticed, finding a moment of happiness and turning it into annihilation, then sitting down to eat afterward as if murder were just another private indulgence. And when society sees that clearly enough, it begins asking the question it hates the most: what if this isn't fixable? That question is the point of no return, not for Arthur, for everyone else. The conviction brings no real relief, not at first. Relief suggests lightness. This case doesn't allow lightness. Even in the moments where people tell themselves, he's caught, he's convicted, he can't hurt anyone right now, the mind immediately adds the next sentence: but what about later? Because later is where fear lives. Later is where parole hearings happen. Later is where the system reviews sentences and considers age and behavior and mental state and rehabilitation. Later is where lawyers argue that decades have passed, that risk is reduced, that the offender is no longer the same person. In many cases, that logic is fair. In many cases, it's necessary. But Arthur Hutchinson is not many cases. And the public understands that in a way that bypasses legal complexity. They understand it in the oldest way humans understand danger. They imagine him behind someone else's house. They imagine their own patio door failing to lock. They imagine waking to footsteps on stairs. They imagine hearing their child scream. And once people start imagining that, they stop caring about legal nuance.
They care about certainty. They care about permanence. They care about never having to see his face on the outside again. That's why this case changes shape after conviction. It becomes more than a trial. It becomes a national argument over what society owes itself, punishment or protection. Arthur Hutchinson, sitting inside the machinery of law, senses the change too. Some offenders shrink after conviction. They begin to understand the finality. They become quiet because there's nothing left to bargain with. But Hutchinson is the kind of man who cannot accept being powerless. Powerlessness is his true prison. Even before this case, his life had been a tug of war with authority, in and out of custody, in and out of prison, always testing, always resisting, always convincing himself he was smarter than the people trying to contain him. That is why he gave himself the nickname the Fox, not because he earned it, because he needed it. He needed a self-image that made him feel above the world. And now that self-image is collapsing, because the court has done something he can't control. It has turned him from predator into defendant, from hunter into specimen, from myth into file. And that kind of reduction is unbearable to a man like him. So he tries to reclaim power in the only way he still can, with denial, with grievance, with claims of unfairness, with the posture of someone who believes he's the victim of persecution rather than the cause of catastrophe. Even the words he uses reveal his psychology. He doesn't speak like a man who mourns what he did. He speaks like a man angry he's being restricted, angry he can't move, angry he can't choose, angry that other people now decide his future. And in the courtroom, this anger doesn't play as innocence. It plays as something else, a kind of hollow contempt, a refusal to accept reality. Sentencing is where the system stops describing the past and begins shaping the future. The judge is not there to entertain the public, not there to match grief with emotion, not there to perform outrage. The judge's job is to deliver a lawful decision that can withstand scrutiny, a decision built on principle, not on rage. And that is exactly why the moment becomes even heavier, because when a calm voice delivers a permanent sentence, it feels colder and more terrifying than any emotional outburst. The court considers what happened that October night, a family celebrating a wedding, a safe village, a respected home. The father, Basil, the mother, Avril, the son, Richard, the youngest daughter, Nicola, alive but permanently changed. Then it considers the offender, Arthur Hutchinson, already an escaped convict, already suspected of rape and burglary, already with years of violent history. A man who didn't stumble into this. He moved towards it. He watched. He entered deliberately. He stabbed his way through obstacles. He raped the youngest daughter. He dragged her into the marquee. He ate and drank like the home belonged to him. And then he left, not in a frenzy, not in confusion, but like he had finished something, finished consuming, finished controlling, finished turning other human beings into objects in his story. Those facts matter because they demonstrate intent, mindset, and capacity. They demonstrate something deeper than violence. They demonstrate a psychological profile that doesn't fit comfortably inside the usual framework of release and reform. And the judge knows it. Everyone in the room knows it. This is not a man who needs a long sentence. This is a man who represents an ongoing threat as long as he exists. So the court goes beyond ordinary language. Arthur Hutchinson is sentenced to life imprisonment. But life is not treated as a possibility with a future door. It is treated as a final containment, a rare whole life order, a sentence that makes the state's intent unmistakable. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars. He will never be considered for parole. He will never be released. This is the point of no return. because unlike minimum terms, unlike parole eligibility, unlike any other legal option that suggests the possibility of change, a whole life order says something different. We are not waiting to see if you improve. We are not gambling on your reform. We are not risking another family. For the public, those words land like a heavy lock turning. For victims' families, they land like the only kind of certainty the system can still offer. For Nicola, it doesn't erase trauma, but it removes the nightmare of future headlines. No parole hearing, no reevaluation, no possibility of his release becoming a fresh wound every decade. And for Arthur Hutchinson, it is an existential threat. Because the sentence doesn't just imprison him, it erases the one thing he depends on, the belief that he can get out. Predators can endure confinement if they can imagine return, if they can imagine reclaiming control, if they can imagine future victims, future dominance, future freedom. A whole life order kills that future. It tells him his story ends in a cell. And that is why he begins fighting the sentence immediately. He appeals, again and again, over years, over decades, not because he discovers new truth, because he cannot accept finality. The appeals are framed as legal arguments, human rights, fairness, proportionality. He pushes his case as far as he can, even towards the European Court of Human Rights, arguing that a lifetime sentence without parole breaches fundamental rights. And this part of the story angers people for a reason, because it forces a psychological confrontation. A man who granted no mercy to a family demands mercy for himself. A man who destroyed a home argues that the system is destroying his life. But the law is not built to satisfy anger. The law is built to withstand it. So the appeals are reviewed, and when the conclusion arrives, it is cold in its clarity. The whole life order is upheld as appropriate, justified, necessary. In other words, society has the right to permanently protect itself from a danger like this. It becomes official. The boundary is real. The door is sealed. And that is where the true point of no return settles into place. Because the sentence isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different kind of haunting. A haunting that doesn't come from the killer moving freely. It comes from the survivor trying to live in a world that still contains him, even behind walls. It comes from the knowledge that he will wake each day in prison and still exist, still breathe, still age, still remember, still be remembered. People like Hutchinson don't disappear neatly when you lock them away. They remain in public imagination like a stain. They become a reference point for fear, for debates about justice, for the idea that some humans sit outside the reach of rehabilitation. And even when society decides to bury him alive,
A whole life order sounds like an ending. It sounds like the final frame of a documentary. The monster locked away, the key thrown into the sea, the world allowed to heal. But the truth is colder than that, because sentencing doesn't reverse time. It doesn't undo the moment a patio door failed to lock. It doesn't rewind footsteps on stairs. It doesn't pull a father back up from the bottom step. It doesn't put a mother back into the life she fought for with every part of her body. It doesn't place a son back under the blankets where sleep should have protected him. And it doesn't return Nicola to the version of herself that existed before she learned what it feels like to be hunted inside your own home. What falls in this act isn't only Hutchinson's freedom. That already collapsed the moment handcuffs snapped shut. What falls here is something bigger, something harder to name. The illusion that justice creates clean endings. The illusion that once the offender is caged, the story stops moving. Because even with Arthur Hutchinson permanently sealed behind prison walls, his actions keep traveling forward. Like a sound you can't turn off, like a stain you can't scrub out. And the people left behind are forced to learn what survivors of extreme violence learn in silence. That the offender may lose the world, but the victim loses the version of the world that ever felt safe. The Layton home becomes the center of a strange contradiction. From the outside, it remains a house, bricks, windows, garden. But on the inside, the home is no longer a sanctuary. It's a memory trap, a place where every staircase becomes the staircase. Every hallway becomes the hallway. Every sound at night becomes that sound. And for the surviving sisters, Nicola and Suzanne, the pain isn't only grief, it's contamination. Because a wedding day is supposed to be preserved in photographs, in laughter, in family stories repeated with warmth for decades. Instead, this wedding becomes an origin point for horror, a before and after line that can never be blurred. Suzanne had left in a car covered in confetti, just married written across it, in joy. Hours later, her family was dead. And this is where the human mind breaks in ways most people don't understand, because there is no gradual adjustment to something like that. There is no gentle transition. You wake up one day married, and then you wake up in a world where marriage anniversaries and birthdays are now changed to crime scene images. A celebration becomes evidence. A memory becomes a wound. And even the smallest details, champagne, a white marquee, a garden, can become triggers strong enough to steal your breath. The fall here is personal and permanent, not the fall of a killer, the fall of ordinary life. Nicola especially becomes trapped in an impossible double identity. To the public, she is the brave survivor, the young woman who identified the killer, the reason the fox was caught, the person who stood in court and spoke through trauma until the law had no choice but to listen. But to Nicola herself, survival isn't a trophy. It's a sentence, a different kind of whole life order, one imposed by memory. Because while Arthur Hutchinson will live inside walls, Nicola must live with images that don't have walls. She heard the killings, not as a headline, not as a rumor, as sound, as real movement through a house she'd once trusted. Then she was violated in a way that doesn't just harm the body, it attacks the idea of ownership over oneself. And then she was tied up and left like an object. Later, people asked the question everyone asks in these cases, the question that sounds logical until you live inside it. Why didn't he kill her too? As if death is the only tragedy, as if survival is automatically mercy. But in the darkest corners of true crime, survivors will tell you something uncomfortable. Some killers understand that leaving someone alive can be its own kind of cruelty. It forces the victim to carry the offender forever. It forces the victim to replay the moment again and again. It forces the victim to wonder daily whether the world will ever truly be safe. That's why Nicola's survival is heroic. Not because she lived, because she endured what living required after. And no one can see that endurance from the outside. It happens in the quiet moments. When you hear a door click at night, when you smell something metallic and your mind snaps backward, when you see a marquee in someone else's garden and suddenly your body forgets how to breathe. That is the aftershock of predatory violence. It doesn't end with conviction, it spreads. Meanwhile, Arthur Hutchinson's fall becomes something more humiliating than prison itself. Because he doesn't just lose freedom, he loses his identity. The Foxsmith was built on elusiveness, cleverness, superiority. It was his way of making himself feel powerful in a world that often treated him like a petty criminal. But now the Fox is reduced to an inmate number. Routine meals, locked doors, scheduled movement. He is surrounded by walls designed specifically for men like him to never touch the world again. And for a man like Hutchinson, that environment is a slow suffocation. Not because he regrets what he did, because there is no audience. There are no newspapers printing his nickname on the front page anymore. No reporters taking his calls. No manhunt. No national fear to feed on. Just repetition, monotony. The long erosion of a man who once believed he could outsmart everyone, now forced to accept that the most permanent power belongs to the system. Even the act of aging becomes punishment, because out there he wanted to be feared. In prison, fear is currency, but it's not the kind of fame he wanted. He doesn't get legend,
He gets containment. He gets to be known not as a clever fox, but something uglier, a reminder, a warning, a man the country decided should never walk among ordinary people again. And that humiliation is where the fall becomes complete. Because you can lock a predator up physically, but ego is harder. Ego fights. Ego appeals. Ego argues human rights. Ego insists the world is unfair. And Hutchinson does exactly that. Years of appeals, attempts to reshape the narrative, attempts to argue that the sentence is too harsh, too permanent. But each denial he receives from the system is another collapse of the myth, another confirmation that his performance no longer matters. The system is no longer reacting to him. It is simply containing him. And nothing is more unbearable to a man addicted to control than being treated as irrelevant. The fall spreads outward, too, into the larger public consciousness, because this case becomes a landmark reference in how people talk about punishment. It becomes one of those stories that changes law not necessarily on paper, but in emotion, in expectation, in what the public believes should happen to someone who commits violence like this. The public learns about whole life orders, rare sentences reserved for the most dangerous offenders. And the case becomes part of that conversation, part of the mental list people reach for when they argue that some criminals should never walk free again. But here's what's disturbing about that cultural impact. Even when the public agrees on the sentence, they still can't stop thinking about the doorway, the broken patio catch, the idea that the entire disaster began with something so mundane. That's why people remember this story. Because it doesn't require a complex conspiracy or secret criminal network. It requires only one predator and one home that thought it was safe. The fall, then, isn't just Hutchinson's. It's everyone's certainty. People start seeing safety differently. They begin understanding that danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always come with flashing signs. Sometimes it arrives hungry, injured, and bitter. And it chooses the brightest house on the darkest night. In the aftermath, the surviving sisters become the final proof of what true crime rarely shows honestly. There is no clean ending. Suzanne lives with the impossible contrast, her wedding day permanently fused to her family's deaths. Nicola lives with trauma that will never be fully visible, but always fully present. And the world continues. That's the cruelest part. News cycles move on. Other crimes happen. Other names replace his in headlines. But inside the private lives of those connected to Door Road, time doesn't behave normally. It bends around October 23, 1983. It keeps returning there like a needle stuck in a groove. And even with Arthur Hutchinson locked away forever, there remains one unresolved, sickening mystery at the heart of it. Was this truly random? Or was there a moment, some tiny decision, some small piece of vulnerability that made the Laytons stand out to him? Was it simply the noise of a wedding, the sight of wealth, the presence of a young girl? Or was it something in his head, some internal logic no one can fully map? That uncertainty is what makes the case feel unfinished even with a permanent sentence, because we like to believe tragedy has rules. We like to believe we can learn a lesson and avoid it. But this case refuses the comfort of clarity. It gives only a warning that evil doesn't always come from people you know. Sometimes it comes from the edge of the garden, watching you celebrate, waiting for the moment the lights go out. And even after it's caught,
long after the courtroom's empty, the case remains. Not as evidence, not as headlines, as residue. That's what stories like this leave behind. Psychological residue that settles into the corners of ordinary life and never fully lifts. Because when a family is destroyed inside their own home, something changes in the world that can't be repaired with sentences or legal language. A whole life order is meant to be final. It is the system's strongest attempt to contain danger permanently. Arthur Hutchinson will grow old behind bars, a man the country decided was too dangerous to ever release. But the echo of what he did doesn't live in prison. It lives where the crime happened. It lives in the survivors. It lives in the imagination of everyone who heard the story and suddenly looked at their own back door differently. The idea that this case ends cleanly is comforting, but comfort isn't the truth. The truth is that the ending is the most unsettling part, because what happens afterward is not a conclusion, it's a continuation, quiet, private, and sometimes invisible. For Nicola, the echo begins with the simplest things: a sound in the night, a creak in a hallway, a sudden change in silence. Most people hear those sounds and roll over, but after a night like October 23, 1983, silence becomes suspicious. Quiet becomes heavy. Because the body learns danger the way it learns pain, deeply, permanently, without needing permission from the mind. That's why survivors often describe trauma not as memory, but as a kind of internal alarm system that never stops scanning. The rational brain can say, "He's in prison, you're safe," but the nervous system doesn't speak rational language. It speaks in flashes, in muscle tension, in spikes of adrenaline, in sudden nausea that comes from nowhere. Nicola didn't just survive violence. She survived the destruction of her internal sense of safety, and once that is destroyed, it doesn't return fully. People call survivors strong, as if strength is a medal you wear. But strength in cases like this is quieter. It's waking up anyway. It's living anyway. It's carrying the past without letting it swallow the future, most days, not all days. Because not all days cooperate. Certain dates don't cooperate. Certain smells don't cooperate. Champagne, for example, is no longer just a drink. It's a symbol of violation, a reminder that a man could kill your family and then use their celebration like fuel. A white marquee isn't just a party tent, it's a cage. A chair isn't just a chair, it's the place your body learned helplessness. And the mind doesn't separate those things cleanly. It binds them to fear. So the echo follows Nicola, not as a story she tells, but as a story her body keeps retelling. For Suzanne, the echo is different, but no less brutal. Because she wasn't in the house that night. She didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't see the knife. She didn't endure the hours of terror. Instead, she lived through something uniquely cruel. The most important day of her life became the opening chapter of the worst tragedy of her life. She left her family home that night as a bride, happy, newly married, wrapped in the kind of optimism only weddings create. She drove away under confetti, people smiling, people waving, people believing in beginnings, and then her family was erased. This kind of loss creates a specific psychological torture, because Suzanne has to live with an impossible contrast. Weddings are usually stored in memory as bright, joyful, permanent, but her wedding is welded to death. Every anniversary becomes complicated. Every memory of that garden is contaminated. Every photograph carries an invisible shadow. The smile you see in wedding pictures, if you know what happens after, looks different. It looks fragile. It looks temporary. It looks like people standing on the edge of a cliff without knowing it. And that's the echo for Suzanne. A life in which joy is never pure again. Not because she doesn't deserve joy, but because her mind can't stop linking celebration with catastrophe. The human brain seeks patterns to protect itself, so it becomes cautious about happiness, because happiness, in her story, was followed by devastation. That's not superstition. That's survival psychology. Then there's the village, Door. Places like Door change quietly after crimes like this, not in dramatic public ways, in habits, in subtle shifts, in doors that are now locked where they were once left open, in curtains closed earlier, in people who check their gardens before bed, in neighbors watching strangers with a new edge,
in the way children are raised with warnings that didn't exist before. The echo becomes communal, because a massacre committed by a stranger does something profound. It teaches a community that danger doesn't need an invitation, that evil doesn't have to be let in. Sometimes it enters through ordinary life itself, through a celebration, through noise, through a door that doesn't latch. And once that lesson is learned, it never fully unlearns. Even decades later, older residents remember exactly where they were when they heard the news, exactly how their stomach dropped, exactly what they did afterward. Locks installed, dogs adopted, routines changed. Because fear doesn't need to stay intense to stay influential. It can become normalized, like background noise, a quiet awareness that never disappears. And that's what Hutchinson left behind. Not just bodies, a new baseline of mistrust. Arthur Hutchinson, meanwhile, becomes old in prison. The fox ages. His hair goes gray. His body weakens. Years stack up. He appeals his sentence repeatedly, trying to argue his way out of permanent containment, but the system doesn't move. That's what whole life orders are meant to be, immovable. There is no softening, no parole board weighing his progress, no hearing that offers hope, just time. And while he grows older behind bars, society wrestles with the concept of a man being locked away until death. Some argue it is justice, some argue it is cruelty. But the case itself answers the debate in a way that logic can't, because the details of the crime aren't theoretical, they are real. They are measured in wounds. They are measured in blood on stairs. They are measured in a teenager tied to a chair while the killer drank champagne. And that's why when courts upheld the whole life order, even after Hutchinson tried to challenge it through human rights arguments, it wasn't simply a legal ruling. It was a reflection of public psychology. The country had seen what he was capable of, and it decided there was no acceptable scenario where he should be allowed to try again. But the most disturbing part of this story is not that he will die in prison. It's the question